Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar on using proficiency scales in a competency-based system. My name is Sean Duncan, and I am the Strategic Change Officer with Empower Learning. My contact info is there. If you have any questions after today's session, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So I am lucky to be joined today by two luminaries in the K-12 education world, Dr. Robert Marzano and Scott Bacon. So I'll introduce both of them in just a moment, but before I do, I'd like to just take care of a few quick housekeeping items for today to help with our logistics. So first up, feel free to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We are present there and do a lot of announcing and sharing of resources there. Please visit us at empowerlearning.net, not .com. And then for today's session, feel free to use the chat feature to check in and extend the conversation. And then you can use the Q&A section to submit any questions. We will have a Q&A section at the end of today's content presentation, and we'll address as many questions as we have time for at that point. So with that said, so I'll start with Dr. Marzano. He is co-founder and chief academic officer of Marzano Resources and founder of the Marzano Academies. He's also executive director of Empower Learning, so we're lucky to have him with us. And during his 53 years in education, he's worked with educators as a speaker and a trainer as well. He's authored more than 50 books and 300 articles on topics like instruction, assessment, writing and implementing standards, cognition, effective leadership, and school intervention. His research-based strategies are known internationally and are widely practiced by both teachers and administrators. So welcome, Dr. Marzano. And then Scott Bacon is both founder and chief R&D officer here at Empower Learning. He's a pioneer, thought partner, and innovator of the earliest sustained models of competency-based education. And his contributions have helped propel this transformational competency-based ed approach to a nationwide conversation. So welcome, Scott. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Marzano.
Oh, heck. I want to make sure I can share my screen. Excuse me. So hopefully you can see my screen, correct?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for being here. It's been my pleasure to be with Empower. I work with Empower Learning for, my gosh, over a decade, but I've been officially a part of Empower just for about 3 years, and it's been great. And I've known Scott as the co-founder of Empower during that entire period, and the Empower system is second to none when it comes to competency-based education, which is our topic today. More specifically, proficiency scales within a competency-based system or competency-based classroom. So I'm going to present from kind of very general to specific, and Scott's going to at the end show you how this looks in a CBE designed LMS. So proficiency scales, what are they and why do we need them? So I want to start with why do we need them? Now, I actually started working with proficiency scales way back in the early 90s. So, and I believe I coined the term proficiency scale. At least in my head, I did. That's not to say that I did. Somebody else didn't come up with the name, and I took it and just forgot about that. The first book I ever wrote on the topic was in 1996. It was entitled Comprehensive, excuse me. My gosh, I forgot the title. I've got an excuse. I turned 75 just a couple of weeks ago, so I just forgot the title of my book. It dealt with the comprehensive model for designing standards-based district schools and classroom. There, I did get it. We had actually been working on proficiency scales in the early 90s. So they've actually been around for a long time. We've got a particular version of them Our version looks like this, and I'll go into some depth in this, but it's really 3 levels of content, but actually 4 levels of the scale. But if you have half-point scores, you got 9 levels of the scale. So proficiency scale, it goes from 0 to 4.0, and if you have half-point scores, you got 9 different score values there. And the target is usually the 3.0. And that will be stated, your proficiency scale will be stated in terms of expectations for student. In this case, the student will explain how vision sight is a product of light reflecting off objects, et cetera, et cetera. The 2.0 content will typically be those things that a teacher wants to directly teach that are fundamental or necessary to understand the 3.0 level. And an important part is that these things are going to be directly taught. The teacher or the school or the district believes they're so important, they should be directly taught. And the 4.0 deals with going above and beyond what is expected at the proficient level. We'll get back to that. Now, why do you need them? A reasonable question is, well, wait a minute, we've got our standards. Why do we need proficiency scales? Well, I'll take a little bit of time on this. And I'll give you a couple of sources here to look at if you want the research behind this. Here's one of the problems with proficiency with standards is there's just way too much content in the standards, and there always has been. Standards movement started in the early 90s. It's gone through many iterations. The last big one was, Common Core. And I know it was controversial in a couple of places, but states took the Common Core and adaptation of it and made their own. Still, there's way too much content that are typically in standards as stated. Some examples here, and these are all taken from various standards, documents, past and present. This here, darn it. Let me do this. Sorry, guys. Now, what did I just do? Scott, help me here. I now stuck my.
Dr. Marzano, you might hit the escape button on your keyboard. That might take a little bit.
No, I just did. Escape. Come on, guys. Okay. Thank you. When technology becomes idiot-proof, I won't make mistakes like that. But as you can see, the standard statement up there, and this happens to be a 3rd grade standard, excuse me, a standard appropriate for grade 6 through 8. It really encompasses, 5 different aspects. Understanding the distributive property of rational number, understanding the commutative property, et cetera, et cetera. Standard statements commonly are very packed with a lot of specific content. Here's some more. Here's a reading standard, grade 6 through 8. The standard looks simple. Use a variety of strategies to extend reading vocabulary, but that really includes a bunch of elements, 6 in this case. Same thing with writing. Uses strategies to draft and revise written work. That sounds simple, but it's really not. A very complex process involving 7 steps there. Reread, rearrange word, sentence, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give you a couple more, but you get the example, you get the idea here. That standards documents as written, whether they're at the state level or even national exemplars, always have an awful lot of content, no matter what subject area you're in. That proliferation of content is still there. Additional problem with standards, there's an awful lot of redundancy let me go back to the too much content for a second. Actually, we did an analysis of the Common Core a few years back. And actually, one of the goals of the Common Core was to increase the rigor of the standards, what's expected of students. And the Common Core did that, it really did. Very rigorous expectations. But another one was to make the standards more parsimonious, kind of lean and mean, focused. And they really just didn't accomplish that. They're good try, but didn't. Actually, math did a decent job. English language arts had some trouble. For example, we analyzed 8th grade English language arts for the Common Core and found about 76 standard statements But each one of those standard statements had about an average of about 5 topics embedded within them. You do a little bit of math and you've got about 350 some, topics that 8th grade ELA teachers are expected to address, in a 180-day school year. Another problem is redundancy. This actually helps solve the problem, because if you take out the redundancy, you decrease your standards significantly. Here's an example from over on the right here. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different standards, with their codes. There's a reading one, a writing, a couple of writing ones, writing. I guess SLMOS, I'm not sure what it is. Spoken language, maybe. But if you read through these, you see a lot of statements about, creating relevant arguments, claims, evidence, sound reasoning. And even though different terms might be used, there's a lot of redundancy in those. I mean, you're basically teaching the same thing, even though they're written, the expectations are written different and different terminology, stated differently. Another problem with standards is there's equivocal descriptions of content. Let me explain what that means. You have a standard and it looks pretty straightforward, but when you look at it, you say, well, what exactly should I be doing with that? Here's one. This is obviously mathematics. Solve multi-step word problems with whole numbers and have whole number answers using the 4 operations: addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. You get the idea. That can be interpreted at least 4 different ways, and it's very different expectations for students based on your interpretation. For example, if you're focusing on addition, here's an addition problem. James wants to paint racing stripes around his room. His room is 11 feet long and 10 feet wide. If James paints a strip to go around, you get the whole idea. Now that's different, very different set of operations that students are expected to do from a subtraction problem that might be based on that standard. And that's very different from a multiplication problem that might be based on that standard, which is very different from a division problem. So you get the idea. An equivocal statements means that a standard can be interpreted in many different ways, and each one of those interpretation requires a different set of skills for the students. High school level, analyze multiple interpretations of a story, drama, or poem. Now, those are different tasks. Multiple interpretations of a story is a different task than of drama or poetry. So again, you get the idea. So what do we do? What do we K-12 educators do? Standards are good things, but they don't easily translate into something teachers, schools, or districts can use to design and implement a competency-based system. Well, here's some things you can do. One is you take your standard, and as a group, and this is best done at the district level, you actually boil down the standard into what we call a focus statement. And what's the core? What's the gist of it? Now you're going to take all the good stuff from the standards and put it back in when you create a proficiency scale. But this is just an exercise to get you to say, well, what do we really want to emphasize here? So the focus statements are single statements about what the standard, what expectation do you want to carry from the standard to your students? And then create what we call measurement topics from that. So the measurement topic is just a short version of the focus statement. Now, from that, you can create a proficiency scale. And again, many different versions of proficiency scales, but this is the one I've used for many years and we recommend, although there's certainly other versions you can use. So again, the 3.0 is the target. That's going to be the interpretation of your focus statement. When you state it in a proficiency scale, you're going to elaborate on that. You're going to give examples, of what is expected of the student. The 2.0 will be the simpler content, that you will teach that's not explicit in the standard, but you think is important to the standard that you're going to teach that. The 4.0 will be going above and beyond. They understand advanced content. It's clearly above what's expected of them. The 1.0 will not represent new content, but it does represent a level of ability relative to the content. This is the 1 and the 0, not new content, but they do represent, again, levels of ability below the expectancy at the 3.0 level. And if you're a Vygotskian follower, Lev Vygotsky and his notion of zone of proximal development, that's where score 1 and 2 make sense, that they represent levels of ability below students being able to do it on their own. So 1.0 is they can do it with help. And at the 0 level, even with help, they don't have any success. Now, I always say students should never get a 0, because if you're helping a student and they have no success, there's maybe something more wrong with the help than there is with the student. So sources of proficiency scale, where do you go? Do you create these on your own, or do you look for ones that have already been created? Well, you can, in any one of those. MarzanoResources.com, is a place that you can go to look at what are called the critical concepts. Scott mentioned that that's an organization. I'm the chief academic officer there. You can take a look at those. They're meant to be used by districts and schools to adapt them to their local standards and add to them and subtract from them, et cetera, et cetera. You can get examples from schools and districts across the country. Really nice thing is that number of schools and districts that have created proficiency scales actually post them, free. They're sharing what they've learned. So you can just do a Google search on specific proficiency scales for specific subject areas. You're going to probably find some useful examples there, or you can create your own for measurement topics derived from your standards. Now, if you're using our LMS, Empower Learning will be happy to give you guidance in that area, to actually create standards, measurement topics, and proficiency scales of your own, or even if you're using someone else's, that's something we do as in particular as it fits with our LMS. So again, here's what a proficiency scale looks like in our scheme. It should make a little more sense right now. This is adapted from a book that I did in 2017. I'll give you the name of that book in a second. But again, the proficiency scale actually spells out a little more detail. So the 3.0, student will identify factors that contribute to weathering and erosion, et cetera, et cetera. Notice the examples, that are there for students. For example, students will explain how water, ice, wind, et cetera, et cetera. So you actually do get more explicit in the proficiency scale. Look at the 2.0. And our system 2.0 typically has vocabulary. Student will recognize and recall specific vocabulary, for example, erosion, sediment, water. They'll also understand basic processes or be able to execute basic processes. Sometimes that's just recall of basic factual information. And at the 4.0, by definition, it's in addition to the score 3.0, the student will demonstrate in-depth inferences and applications that go beyond what they were taught. Now, we always say there should be an example of that. For example, research the solution that addresses the cause of weathering and erosion, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that provides a lot of guidance, to students. It provides a lot of guidance to teachers, and it provides a lot of information to parents who are trying to interpret how well their students are doing. More examples here. These happen to be all 4th grade mathematics. These are examples from the critical concepts that Marzano Resources puts out. As you can see, very detailed, still very focused though. Notice the 2.0 has a great deal of detail, and because remember, that's the content you're going to teach directly. School or district might add to this. They might delete some of these things because they feel like it doesn't have to be taught directly. When creating measurement topics and proficiency scales, we also recommend that you add content in addition to the academic content. For example, metacognitive skills and cognitive skills and knowledge application skills. All of those can be translated into proficiency scales at different levels. Here's an example of the metacognitive skills we commonly recommend. And you'll recognize these metacognitive. They've been around for a long time, planning for goals and making adjustments. There's a description of what that is. Staying focused when answers and solutions are not immediately apparent, pushing the limits of your knowledge and skill, generating and pursuing your own standards of excellence, seeking incremental, et cetera, et cetera. These have been around since the 1980s. And actually, it was Ben Akalik and Art Costa who really made these popular and really brought them to our attention. They still do work in this area. They're just phenomenal people, just brilliant minds. These two can be translated into proficiency scales. Now, you probably won't do this grade level by grade level. What we recommend is more of a K through 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12 approach. So you basically identify what's the score 3.0 content at those grade level bands. There's some examples. And then create a proficiency scales from that. This happens to be K2 for the skill of staying focused when answers and solutions are not immediately apparent. So notice at the 3.0 level that when the teacher asks, the student can recognize if they're executing the skills. Now, once you have proficiency scales, it really guides your assessment in many different ways. A couple of books that you might look at to this end, making classroom assessments reliable and valid, the new art and science of classroom assessment. And now the proficiency scale looks a little different in terms of its use. You use it as a way of interpreting how well students are doing. And actually, this is using this allows you to measure where students are, their status, and actually their growth too, in terms of the specific topics that are embedded in the proficiency scales. Notice the 3.0 basically says no major errors or omissions regarding the information and skills, simple or complex, that were explicitly taught. So this scale. These decisions can be applied to any of the proficiency scales to score students on various types of assessments that you've created. We actually recommend you use half-point scores when you're using proficiency scales for assessment. Some schools and districts just like to use the whole point scores. We recommend you also use the half-point scores. You can also keep track of students in a very detailed manner if you're using proficiency scales for assessment. These little bar graphs are particularly useful, I think, in terms of communicating to students, parents, communicating to teachers, where students are now and where they started. See, each one of the rows represents a measurement topic. For each one of the rows, there's also a proficiency scale. And the bar graph will represent where a student is. The dark part of the bar graph represents where the student currently is, where the current student started at the beginning of the year. And the light part of the bar graph is where they are right now. So the light part, when you add the light part, you actually get student growth. Some misconceptions about competency-based education. One is that you can't use overall grades. You can. This is a report card that still has overall grades at the top there, but also see the bar graphs. So you get an overall omnibus grade using traditional, ABCD if you wish. You can also use percentage scores, but also you get that detailed information about where they are right now and where they started. All you need is to translate a conversion chart. Here's one. Where the scores on proficiency scales, now this would be across proficiency scales. If during a grading period you had 7 proficiency scales that you were working with students on, at the end of the grading period, each student had a score on each one of those proficiency scales. You would average those and translate that average into an overall grade. You can do it with a 100-point scale. You can get very detailed to very granular in terms of the increments of the translation, either to letter grades or to percentage scores. Now, what this does when you have proficiency scales is make classroom assessment the primary type of assessment. You're still going to have your interim assessments, you're still going to have your year-end assessments, but classroom assessment is the first and primary type of information that we're getting in terms of how students are doing. You're going to have to think of assessment differently. Assessment is not always going to be the traditional test. Notice here we have a number of things listed as possible assessments. Probing discussions, that's when you sit down and ask students to explain things to you relative to the proficiency scale. We even have student self-assessment and student generated assessments. Here's a student-generated assessment. We call it personal tracking matrix, where a proficiency scale is translated into each element of a proficiency scale has each row, its own row. This happens to be at the primary level. And now the students fill out the scale that represent the columns, after the first column. For example, I'm just beginning. Sorry, I'm getting a little blind in my old age, Hal. I know some of this. I've got this. I know this very well. That's their self-assessment. The important part is their evidence. That's that last column there, the column right before the last, where they actually have to record the evidence that they used that brought them to their conclusions about how well they were doing. Some people always challenge, oh my gosh, student self-assessment, is that really valid? If you follow John Hattie's work, you've got your answer in his work over since 2009, when he did his meta-analysis and first wrote the book, Visible Learning. He had 138 variables. Look at the first one. Number one was student self-reported grades. That's what I just showed you. Students reporting their perspective of how well they know a topic. In 2012, he updated his meta-analysis at 150 variables in the book, Visible Learning for Teachers. Still at the top. And in 2015, updated again with 195 variables. Self-reported grades went to number 3, but look at what number 1 is: teacher estimates of achievement. So the judgment of students and teachers, in that massive meta-analysis by John Hattie, has always been at the top, literally, at the top. Your assessments, you can look at them in ways other than the traditional tests. Now, if you really want to go into this, if you go to empowerlearning.net and go to free resources, you'll see a section on the Marzano growth calculator. Then read with a free online download that, click on that, the download. And you'll have the document entitled Documenting Student Learning Using Classroom Assessments. And that'll go into probably more depth than you want about how you use assessments. What about instruction? Well, instruction and transparency within a CBE system, when proficiency scales are used, kind of go hand in glove. Here's what I mean by transparency. Transparency means that what is expected of students is transparent to everybody, the students for sure, but also the teacher, administrators, and the family. They know exactly what's expected of students. So imagine you have children and one of your daughter is in 5th grade mathematics, and your daughter goes first day of class, and what she brings home that night is all the proficiency scales that represent 5th grade mathematics and the level of detail that I showed you. I mean, that's the roadmap, right there. Here's what's expected. Now that brings parents into the loop in terms of they're really very fully informed about what's expected, but it also gives them a clear picture of what's going to be covered over the whole year. And given the competency-based system allows students to move ahead if they're at their own pace, well, the roadmap makes that much easier. They now see what's coming, and they can work on topics that might not be covered in the first grading period, but they feel like they're interested in those topics and know them right now. So the transparency is just a really powerful tool in and of itself. By the way, proficiency scales are used in every state in the country. Some places a lot, some places not so much. But again, these things started about 1990. They represent what I used to call a guaranteed and viable curriculum. In a book in 2003 I wrote called What Works in Schools. I coined that term. And the idea was that, one thing that would really tighten the effectiveness of schools is that if within a district, within a school, and better yet within a district, there was a guaranteed curriculum that no matter who taught 5th grade mathematics, certain content was going to be addressed. And actually, I think we've done a very good job at that, we as a profession. But the viability is an issue too. Viability means that what you're guaranteeing will be taught can actually be taught in the time available. And as I mentioned before, that standards as written have so much content that it can't be viable. So the creation of proficiency scales actually helps you create this guaranteed and viable curriculum. You see, this is a science classroom. They have the learning goal. That's the expectation at level 3, written in kind of an I can statement. I will be able to. Down to the right there, lower right, that's the actual proficiency scale. On the left, what you see are students' names, posted at each level of the scale. These are student self-evaluations as to where they think they are. Here's a reading learning goal. Again, the same thing. The expectations stated as an I can or I will statement, the proficiency scale on the right, and then student self-evaluations. This is used at the elementary level. It's used all the way up, advanced placement topics. Very commonly, teachers create simpler versions, student-friendly versions of the scales. There's some examples. They're posted on the walls. Now, given that you have a proficiency scale and it's transparent, this should guide instruction. So I, as a teacher, I know I'm working on this topic. This happens to be an 8th grade topic on the water cycle. Well, I know, that the score 2 content should be directly taught, and it's laid out right there for me. But I can also make some decisions. I can also pre-assess students. And it might be the case that I don't have to do much direct instruction here. It might be the case that I do. I must. It's necessary because students don't know this content. It's necessary to do a lot of direct instruction. So I make instructional decisions based on what aspect of the proficiency scale I'm going to work on. It might be the case that at the level 4, the complex task. Describe and defend what might occur to climate patterns in specific locations, given a dramatic change in one specific process of the water cycle. I might have to do some direct instruction there in terms of how would you make a claim and support that claim. Now, that's instruction and assessment, but here's what it all boils down to. The ability to generate immediate current data for each student for each topic. That's the essence of a competency-based system. All of this information, if it's not easily observed by teachers and parents and students, and then used, a lot of that information is not going to be used to its full potential. That's where the characteristics of an LMS come in. So Scott's going to take this over here, but just some examples before he does. Here's one recommendation we have, that for each, in this immediate data that's immediately available, each student's scores on a proficiency scale for each assignment are available. Also, student scores on the proficiency scale itself. So here are a number of students, those are the rows. This is a particular district's code. The first column, is their code for a particular proficiency scale. But notice, for the first student, you get a quick picture of where they are relative to all the topics that are being addressed at this particular level. Well, I don't want to steal Scott's thunder here, because this is where an LMS can really either make you or break you. So I'm going to unshare my screen. And Scott, if you jump in.
All right, yeah, I'd be glad to. Let me share my screen here. So I'm just going to kind of show from a digital standpoint how there's the organization of this kind of content and how it might be presented. Here we've got something we call a target browser, where I'm looking at a content area of ELA. And right now I just have grade 3, if you will, selected. It's organized into domains or topics, and each topic is broken into the different skills or the proficiency scales that would be included in that topic. So for my first domain here, I have 3 different skills, or 3 different proficiency scales. And if I were to click into that, we can see all of the detail for what is expected as far as when the learning, when you're tracking your learning. Now, what's really interesting about this is, as Bob was already pointing out, even though we represent this numerically, what the number means is this definition. So this entire proficiency scale is like a legend. It's like a glossary. If you get a 2, what does it mean? Well, it never means 70%, right? This isn't an accuracy approach to, you know, you got 7 out of 10. This is, if you got a 2, what does it mean? It means this. It's always very, very specific. And in a competency-based model, we're always trying to answer one essential question. What does the student know now? We want to know very specifically what they know. If they have a score of a 2, we're saying they do know this, and it's very specific. Because we then ask the corollary question, what does the student need to learn next? And from here, we're obviously going to be trying to advance and approach the score 3. So again, a very kind of different idea when we're thinking about what a score means. In our system, a 2 is uniquely defined by every standard, and it's understood what it means by the proficiency scale, which again is kind of that glossary, with the point of answering that key question, what does a student know now? Well, when we start to adjust our approach of learning, where we really are trying to meet the student at the point of their need, we may not want to just look at things in terms of just a grade level, an age, expected level of learning. We may want to see the curriculum now scaffold as through a progression of learning. So here, I still have my same topics, same domains, but across different grade levels, I can see how they progresses in learning over time. Now, what might happen is if we're truly meeting students at the point of our needs or their needs, and we assess those students, we may find that they don't nice and neatly are in all these topics. They may not always be exactly on the same grade level. They may be a little bit below, they may be a little bit above, or right on. So now we need a new way to be able, new lens to look at the curriculum, and we like to see it more from a progression of learning. And something else we can do here is I can overlay this data with a class. And let me modify this because this is more high school. Now, if you notice here, now on each one of these standards, there's a bar chart. And if I mouse over that, I have a class here, a group of 8 kiddos. And I can see that 7 of these students have mastered it, and 1 has not even begun it. Over here, I can see that I have 6 that have mastered and 2 have started working on it, which means they have demonstrated some level of learning, but they have not yet demonstrated mastery. And I can click on that if I wanted to, and I can drill in and take a peek at where each of these kiddos are. And so here I can say, hey, just show me who the not mastered. Remember, we had 2. So these are the 2 kiddos that haven't mastered it. And I can look, if I want to, I can see all the evidences that they might have had historically within the system. And right where they are as far as within the learning. Okay. So what's very interesting about this is regardless of where the learning has happened, this could be day 1 of school. And I get a cohort of kiddos that I've maybe never seen before, but because the data persists, I can see exactly where everybody is left off, what gaps I might have on day 1. I can, and it doesn't matter if the learning took place in another course, if it took place in a thematic unit, if it took place in an individual learning plan. I can see all the evidence as we were looking at earlier as far as the history of it, but it all comes together, coalesces into one story. And that story we are able to present in a very transparent way where we can just kind of see how students are doing. Last thing I'd like to show you is when we are taking that data and we're starting to address where students need to pick up at, you know, we might create an activity, but in a competency-based model, an activity is a little bit unique as far as how we would construct it. Again, I might be looking at this and I can see that, you know, I've got some needs here for this standard. I might be selecting this standard and a couple standards because there is a, you know, a need in the class. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to also select at what level or where in the proficiency scale this activity is targeted to instruct or targeted to allow the students an opportunity to demonstrate learning. If you remember, everything in this proficiency scale is very specific, right? So here we got vocabulary, and it's very specific what the vocabulary is. Now, if I'm going to construct an activity that's going to deal with the vocabulary, I'm going to want to tag this with that standard and that level of learning. If the student does well on this, I will know they got a 2. Now, let's say, for instance, I deployed this activity and a student got 100% score on it. Their accuracy was perfect. Well, the best score in the proficiency scale I could give them and is appropriate to give them is a 2. Because remember, 2 does not mean C, it does not mean 70%. 2 means what the progression scale tells us, the glossary of sorts. And now I can say, yes, the student actually does know this. And as we're gathering that information with all the other different screens that we have to make transparent where students are, we're always going to be able to meet students at that point of need. Okay. So I'll stop right there. That's probably a lot to digest, but I think that's a good few good key concepts to take away.
Do we have any questions, Sean?
We do. So let me start with one that is maybe specific to Scott, because it's on the platform itself. This question is, does Empower only align proficiency descriptors to grades, or are there other ways to align on a continuum?
Okay, that's a good question. There are absolutely other ways to align. This was a choice. The way that all this is organized is really based on choices. We've had districts who, instead of grade levels, they wanted to do grade spans, and they had early elementary was one of these boxes. It wouldn't say 0-1, it would actually say early elementary, upper elementary, middle, high school. There's those ways to organize it as well. It's limited to your creativity as far as how you would like to set these larger bands, because all we're really doing is creating a hierarchy of organization. We take a content area, organize it by levels, whatever we might want, which are organized into domains, which we organize our standards or our proficiency scales into. And at whatever type of naming you want to give at any of those levels, there's no limitation on that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Scott. Okay, next question. What's the connection between scales and equity?
You want to take that, Bob?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot, so I'm not sure what the questioner is specifically getting at. But for me, the proficiency scales allows us to see on a day-by-day basis where each student is. So that helps right there in terms of helping close gaps, because you can see gaps right from day one. I think what it also does is on the side of the student is pull away the veil in terms of what is this thing called school. I really, in my personal belief, that a lot of times students in certain groups, don't do well because they don't know how to do school. And sometimes doing school is a real puzzle. It's kind of trying to figure out, well, what are the expectations of this teacher? The transparency of the proficiency scales. I mean, right from day one, pull that veil back and just like, here's what's expected to you. Also, there's no stigma for being, behind your age grade level in any topic. That's just standard in a competency-based system. In some areas, you're going to be ahead of the game. In some areas, you're going to be behind the game. And so there's no negative interpretation, attached to, well, I'm a little bit behind in this. It makes things like RTI, response to intervention, or multiple tiered system of interventions, makes it much easier because and easier to transition. Identify those students who just need a little extra help, within the context of core instruction versus those who need to be, taken aside and given extra support. So I think it is a real powerful tool in making sure that school is as equitable as possible, for all students. So it's a tool to that end, a tool to taking the next big steps in equity.
I also think just a couple of things, because there are lots of ways to slice that question. I think what's also really important about a proficiency scale is it states what is to be learned, not how something needs to be learned. If you have someone who is not a concrete sequential auditory learner in front of you, this is by no means forcing that learner or limiting that learner to learn in maybe a modality that they are not familiar with. Gone are the days where you've got a textbook that not only says what, but how you're going to have to learn something. You now have the flexibility to maybe address different types of students with different types of activities so that they can show their learning. I think also this truly allows us to address a student as an individual. No longer are we just a slave to a syllabus. No longer are we, forced to ignore needs because we've got the drive at we're heading towards the final. We got to do that. We're literally able to communicate in a very transparent way to the learners, to the parents, to the teachers, exactly where a student is and what they need next. And that I think all helps in that equity conversation.
Yeah, let me add to that, Scott. That's great. Yeah, I don't want to think about the whole assessment side, of judgments about where students are. Proficiency scales allows for students to demonstrate their competence in multiple ways. Just think how many students they get low scores because paper pencil tests just don't fit for them. They might be English as a second language learners. It might be they just don't do well in paper pencil tests. But I went through it very, very quickly. But now you've got multiple ways of gathering assessment information from students. My favorite is the probing discussion, where you just simply sit down with the proficiency scale with a student and saying, just explain this to me. Okay, a little more over here. And then finally, student-generated assessments, where students come to the teacher and say, I know I didn't do well on that paper pencil test, but I know this. Let me show you how I'm going to show you. So I think it really, it takes a lot of the barriers out of the way that currently exist if we just are continually using a summative test that's paper pencil in nature.
Yeah, a couple of points I would add to that, to something that Scott just said, is that a proficiency scale is just laying out what is to be taught, but not how it's to be taught. right? So it's an agreement maybe among teachers at a particular grade level of what content they're guaranteeing those students will be exposed to. How those two individual teachers cover that content is completely a professional decision, right? And then, Dr. Marzano, there was a question that related to what you were just saying about opening up about assessment. The question was, will you all please do another webinar like this that goes into the connection between scales and classroom assessment?
The answer to that is yes, we will.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a big implication. It changes. Proficiency scales change the paradigm with assessment. They absolutely do. And actually, a phrase that we've been using for a long time is with proficiency scales, it allows you to assess more, but test less. And just to explain that, technically what an assessment is anything, and I mean technically, I mean, this is from, the measurement experts. Every 7-8 years or so, the American Psychological Association, in conjunction with National Council of Measurement and Education, in conjunction with the American Educational Research Association, put out a book that's entitled something like Standards for Assessment. But they have a great glossary where they define terms. And I'm paraphrasing, but they basically, an assessment is anything you do to gather information about an individual students or group of students, status or skill on a particular topic at a particular time is an assessment. And actually then, the measurement process is taking that information and mapping it, that's the term they use, mapping it to some scale. Well, the scale we're using is the proficiency scale. So literally a conversation with a student, that's the assessment, that's the information, can be mapped to a particular scale, a proficiency scale, and that's a valid, and I would say more valid type of assessment than many paper pencil tests. Sorry, you got me on my soapbox here. There was a study done a number of years ago by Dr. Sheila Valencia, University of Washington, where she looked at 4 different types of assessments and how much information you got from those. And I believe it was all middle school science, the same topic. And the 4 types of assessments, one was the traditional selected response items, multiple choice, et cetera. The other was short constructed response. The third was a combination of short constructed response and selected response. The fourth is what she called the probing interview. We call the probing discussion, where you simply sit down with the student and say, okay, explain this to me. Show me that. How would you do that? Okay, go back and why did you do that? If my memory serves, and I think it does in this case, the probing discussion gave you 66% more information than you got, from the other three types of assessment. It literally is my favorite type of assessment. Only rivaled by student-generated assessments. So you should gather more assessment information about students, assess more, but test less. You won't have to use as many paper pencil tests, and we're not doing it here. With Empower, we have some features which allow teachers to look at the pattern of scores for students, and we analyze it in ways that really tell us where they are right now and how much they've grown.
Good. I think we have time for a couple more quick questions. Here's the next one. We are developing scales that just use whole points like 1.0, 2.0, et cetera, and not half points. Dr. Marzano mentioned recommending using half points. Please explain the advantages.
Well, the half points help you when scoring students. See, in our scale, I went over it quickly, but the half point scores do not have new content. Half point score is just a description, a statement of what that score, represents in a student. Sorry, Scott, I can't see well enough, but the half point score basically says the student knows the content at the whole score level immediately below it, but doesn't know all of the content at the whole score immediately above it, and they're somewhere in between. That's the half point score. And that's a pretty clear criterion. It really is. Actually, some secondary teachers that I know, instead of 2.5, they'll break it up into, thirds or, quarters, 2.25, 2.50, but you have to define that. And there are some people who say, well, you can't have half point scores. They're not specific. I beg to differ. defined this way, they give very specific guidance. And actually in the reliability studies that I've done over the years, the rigor, the reliability, the precision of a score assigned to a student when you have a half-point score increases over what you get, with just a whole point score. I mean, think about it. You have a student, they know the 2.0 content. They don't know the 3.0 content, but they know some of it. I think it's inaccurate to give them a 2.0. It's certainly inaccurate to give them a 3.0. And that's where interim scores, can be assigned. So that's why.
I've also have had experience through just learning through the School of Hard Knocks. Early on, when we were working with schools, they had scales where there was no half points. And the biggest problem, and you will face this if you don't have half points, just letting you know, it will look like a student's learning is stalled because you've got some gaps between these levels of learning. And for instance, here's even a good case. This score 3 actually has multiple items here that you may need to assess. You might have an activity that is designed just to hit this first point. And if you, and maybe the student does excellent at it, but it's only part of it. If the overall score remains at a 2, you not only does it look like the student stalled in their learning, but it's also not telling a full story. It's not telling the story that the student has demonstrated and has moved towards that next level. We have evidence on hand to show it, but they haven't completed it. And that was a huge piece with one of our elementary schools back in the day, where parents were just looking at a lot of, there was a standard maybe where you had a lot of times tables. And so it took a while for them to do all the times tables, and or high frequency words. Took a while to do all those high frequency words. And it just looked like the students were doing nothing. But that's not the case at all. They had done that. So in our experience, we highly encourage you to do 0.5s. It will allow you to speak a more accurate message to your community, to your learners. And when you get into some more advanced things like pacing and stuff like that, it allows you to have a much more accurate meter to communicate how students are doing. So I'm a little biased on that one.
That's nice, Scott.
Yeah, it's inherently more motivational for students to be able to see that growth, isn't it?
Yeah, that's another key factor is motivation of kiddos. They're seeing something happen instead of just being stagnant. And visually it looks stagnant.
Yeah. Okay, last question that we have is, can you support work for, or can you provide support for our scales work, and what might that look like? Dr. Marzano?
Well, yes, of course we can. Like I say, you have a lot of sources, but yeah, that's something we do. We commonly talk about it in the context of, Empower, but we'll do it, even if you're not using Empower. But yeah, that's something that we do. It can be, it's a detailed process. It could be a tedious process, but it's a very rewarding process. And we recommend that even if you use somebody else's, even if you bought the critical concepts from Marzano resources, although they're designed to be adapted, yeah, that teachers in this school, better yet the district, make it their own. That they actually do the revising, the adding to, and also that after they've used the scales for a year, they go back and tweak them. Add things, delete things. And you could do that the first 2 or 3 years. But they do get to the point where you say, they're good. We've smoothed out the rough edges, and there's a great deal of ownership. So the short answer is yes, we could do that. I guess they would talk to you, Sean, right? If they wanted to.
Yeah, that's correct. And with that, we'll actually just wrap up here for today. So thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate the time that you spent with us. I have my contact info up there. If you have any questions about any of the content that we addressed today, about ways that we could support you either on the pedagogical side or the learning management system side, I'd be happy to field those. We will send out a recording of today's webinar. So because you are a registrant for this, we'll send that out in the next day or so. So keep an eye out for that. And thanks so much for the time. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks, folks.